Hey guys, subscribe to my YouTube channel and press the bell icon for the latest update.
Both sides start with 8 pawns, and while pawns are the least powerful piece on the chessboard, they still play a vital role in deciding who wins and who loses a chess game. Now, pawns are the only piece on the chessboard that cannot move backwards. They are always going to move forward. The first time you move any of your pawns, you can move it 1 or 2 squares. Once the pawn is moved, it can then only move 1 square at a time. As an example, let's take a look at this e2 pawn. The very first time you move it, you can either move it 1 square to e3, or you can move it 2 squares to e4. Once you've moved it, then you can only move 1 square at a time. Let's say that it's black's turn, because in chess, white goes first, they make a move, and then black is going to make a move. You move 1 piece at a time, and you alternate moves with your opponent. Maybe they decide now to play their own pawn here on e7 up 2 squares to e5. At this point, this pawn here on e4 cannot move forward. Pawns do not capture right in front of them, so they cannot take here on e5. So right now, this pawn on e4 is stuck. White can move one of the other pawns on the board. So let's say they wanted to move their c-pawn. Just like the e-pawn we looked at earlier, this c-pawn can either move to c3, one move, or because it's the first time that this pawn is moved, it can also move to the c4 square. In this example, it's white's move. You can see that this pawn here on b4, f3, and g4 are all blocked. The only piece that white can move is this pawn here on d2. And white has the option to move 1 square to d3 or to 2 squares to d4. Let's say that white plays pawn to d4. Now, from black's perspective, there's no legal moves. All of the pawns on the board are blocked by a piece right in front of it. And so if it's black's move, they would have to find another piece on the board to have a legal move. Chess pawns capture diagonally. Let's take a look at the beginning of a chess game and how pawns can capture. If it's white's move, white has the option of playing e3 or e4. Let's say that white does play the pawn here to e4, and black responds with the move d5. Again, the pawn can come here to d6 or d5. It can move 1 or 2 squares the very first time the pawn moves. And now white has more options than they had before. This white pawn here on e4 can either push forward here to e5. There's no pieces blocking it from continuing to move forward. But now it can also capture this material here on d5 because pawns capture diagonally. And they can capture any material diagonally. In this case, the pawn's going to capture this pawn here on d5. And as soon as the white pawn captures here on d5, the piece that it captured is removed from the game. In this example, it's white's move. Both sides, you can tell, have already moved their pawns since the black pawns start on the 7th rank and the white pawns start on the 2nd rank. So when the rest of these pawns are going to move during this game, they can only move 1 square at a time. If it's white's move, white can either play this pawn to c5 or can play this pawn here to d5. Let's say that it does play here to d5. Now from black's standpoint, this pawn here on d6 is now blocked. Pawns cannot capture in front of them, and so because there is no piece here on c5 or on e5, this pawn here on d6 is blocked. Now this pawn here on e6 has 2 legal moves. The first option is to continue to push forward. Since there's no material in front of it here on the e5 square, this pawn can continue to push forward on the board. But because pawns capture diagonally, this pawn here on e6 can take this pawn on d5. Once the pawn captures here on d5, that white pawn is removed from the game. Now, from white's standpoint, this pawn here on c4 has two legal moves. The first option would be to take with the pawn here on d5, since pawns capture diagonally, or the second option would be to play pawn to c5. You can always push forward if there's no pawns or other material in front of that pawn. Now black has two options as far as how to continue. The first option would be to move this pawn here from d5 to push forward, since there's no material blocking it from pushing forward, with the move pawn to d4. Or the second option would be that this pawn here on d6 can now move. While it is blocked from moving forward, it can capture diagonally, so the pawn can take here on c5.
Who alive can't put me in a box. I redefine any definition you got. I am the tiger, I'm making steps to the top. The flames, I rip it up, you just gotta hand me the rock. Take a seat, you cannot stand it. All I know, the flow harder than a Scotch bonnet. Don't try to